The first light of morning came thin and blue over Arlington, and Staff Sergeant Darren Martinez moved through it in perfect cadence, his boots clicking in exact rhythm on black mat and marble. 21 steps, a pause, a turn, then back again. While mist drifted low across white headstones, lined in ranks so precise they looked like a formation that had chosen silence. No one in the crowd spoke above a whisper. Veterans in old campaign caps stood shoulder to shoulder with schoolchildren in matching field trip jackets. A mother held her son's hand against the rail. An elderly couple, both wearing small service pins, leaned forward as if they were at chapel. A retired military nurse, posture still straight despite the years, folded her gloved fingers and kept her gaze fixed on the sentinel's measured path. Near the center of the viewing line, 8-year-old Lily Brennan sat in a wheelchair with a folded flag resting in her lap like something alive, both hands wrapped around it, chin lifted toward the tomb. The air carried that Potomac cold that sharpened breath and thought. It moved through the bare branches above the plaza and touched the polished stone with a sheen that made every surface glow. The marble of the tomb held the light differently than the sky did, giving it a kind of stern radiance, less like architecture than oath made visible. In that hour, the cemetery felt less like a place people visited and more like a place that received them, judged them, and asked one question without words. Do you understand what was paid for your ordinary mourning? Darren's uniform answered before anyone else could. His kepi sat at the exact regulation angle. His white gloves were pristine, bright against the dark stock of the M14 he carried with controlled precision. Every brass element caught dawn and gave it back. Every crease was sharp enough to cut glass. His jacket lay over a frame built by years of load-bearing marches and disciplined repetition, 6'2" of controlled force with not a single wasted motion. To the crowd he looked carved from stone, face unreadable, jaw set, eyes locked on a point only duty could see. Inside he counted without counting. Distance, tempo, breath. The cadence lived in muscle memory now, but memory alone was never enough at the tomb. Vigilance was not performance. Vigilance was a choice renewed every second. He could feel the black mat through the soles of his shoes, sense where marble began, where the turn would land, where the rifle's weight shifted against the line of his shoulder, and where the wind pressed at the edges of cloth. He did not permit distraction, yet he registered the world around him with a depth that bordered on total. A child adjusting in a chair, a cane tapping once against stone, the soft rustle of a program in someone's hand. 21 steps, a measured pause, a precise turn. Again. A high school boy in the second row lowered his phone slowly, almost guiltily, and kept it at his side. He had arrived with the familiar restlessness of someone who expected a history lecture and received a living ritual instead. Now he watched with his mouth slightly open, seeing, perhaps for the first time, that discipline could carry grief without collapsing under it. Beside him, his teacher said nothing. She did not need to. The old Marine with the cane stood 2 places down from Lily. His shoulders had rounded with age, but his bearing had not surrendered. His weathered face held that expression, known to anyone who had stood in formation at dawn and sunset through years that asked too much and gave too little. He tracked Darren's movement with quiet approval and private pain, like one generation saluting another without any need for introduction. Lily's eyes followed every step. She had the focused stillness children bring only to moments they recognize as larger than themselves. The folded flag in her lap had been handled so carefully. Its corners remained crisp, and now and then she tightened her grip as Darren reached each turn. as if anchoring herself to the same rhythm. Her father's absence was present in the way she sat, in the deliberate way she kept her back straight, in the seriousness that had arrived too early and settled too firmly. By the first week of November, the morning ceremonies had drawn larger crowds, not from spectacle, but from hunger, people searching for a place where words like duty and sacrifice still carried their original meaning. Darren reached the end of his line, halted with absolute control, and executed the turn in one smooth, economical movement that felt less like motion than command. The rifle shifted position with flawless timing. The white glove never trembled. His face remained impassive, but beneath that mask his awareness continued to scan. Old training from Afghanistan and Syria never retired. It simply changed uniforms. At the tomb, that edge had a different purpose. Here, readiness protected memory. He had carried that readiness through dust-choked roads in Kunar, through heat that turned body armor into a furnace, through nights when every distant sound became a question of life or loss. A thin, burned scar traced the line of his jaw, faint in this light, a mark left by a convoy strike years earlier. It did not make him dramatic. It made him exact. Pain had taught him geometry, where danger comes from, where it travels, where it stops. At Arlington, those lessons became reverence. Another cycle. 21. Pause. Turn. A young father near the rail lifted his daughter so she could see over winter coats and shoulders. She asked in a careful whisper why the soldier never looked away. The father hesitated, then answered just as softly, "Because he stands for men we can't thank in person." The child nodded with solemn concentration, as if accepting an assignment. The retired nurse closed her eyes for one breath and opened them again. Her mind moved through names, faces, hospital corridors, the fluorescent hum of wards where soldiers fought quietly and sometimes lost quietly. She watched Darren and recognized the kind of composure that did not come from confidence alone, but from a disciplined covenant with pain. At the edge of the plaza, a bugle call from another ceremony carried faintly on the wind, thin as thread and clean as steel. It touched the crowd, passed through coats and scarves, and crossed generations without asking permission. Some visitors straightened instinctively. One veteran removed his cap and held it to his chest. No one prompted him. Darren continued. There was power in the repetition, and the crowd felt it. The cadence was strict, yet never mechanical. Every step declared that remembrance was not an annual sentiment, but a daily labor. Every pause held gravity. Every turn reset the vow. This was not theater. This was stewardship of national memory, entrusted to men trained to endure stillness the way others endured impact. A park guide in a dark overcoat stood back from the rail and watched newcomers enter the plaza with casual expressions that dissolved within seconds. He had seen it for years. Visitors arrived curious, then uncertain, then reverent. The place did that to people. The sentinel did the rest. The light climbed. Mist thinned around the nearest rows of headstones and lifted toward the hill, revealing lines upon lines of white markers, receding into the distance like pages of a book no country ever finished reading. Somewhere beyond those stones were families making breakfast, commuting to work, arguing over small things, living ordinary hours secured by extraordinary debt. Arlington never accused them for that life. It simply insisted they remember who had purchased it. Darren's breathing remained controlled, almost invisible. His shoulders stayed level. The rifle remained steady. His eyes never hunted the crowd, yet he knew the exact weight of their attention. He understood what they projected onto him. steadiness, authority, protection, maybe even a kind of invulnerability. He accepted none of it as personal glory. The uniform did not belong to ego. It belonged to tradition, to the 3rd Infantry Regiment, to the unnamed dead whose stories ended before they could claim witness. He served as the visible edge of that lineage for this hour and no longer, then passed it to the next sentinel. Near the rail, Lily shifted the folded flag and looked up at her mother. "He doesn't get tired," she whispered. Her mother brushed a strand of hair behind Lily's ear and answered, "He does. He just keeps faith anyway." Lily considered that, then returned her gaze to Darren with renewed intensity, as if she had been handed a code and decided to memorize it. 21 steps, then stillness, then the turn, then the return. The old Marine adjusted his cane and gave the smallest nod at the completion of each cycle. It was not applause. It was recognition. Across from him, the high school boy slid his phone fully into his pocket and stood with both hands visible, posture unconsciously straighter, expression transformed from spectator to witness. A gust of wind moved the flag overhead. Its fabric snapped once, then streamed out in full color against the pale sky. The sound carried through the plaza like a command and a benediction at once. Heads lifted. Eyes tracked upward, then settled back on the tomb and the sentinel, keeping watch beneath it. Darren reached the end of his line again and turned. In that turn lived years of training, grief disciplined into service, and the private vows men carry without advertisement. He felt the old names where he always felt them, not as open wounds, but as weight that kept him honest. He had learned that memory, handled correctly, did not weaken a man. It aligned him. The crowd held the silence with him. For a long moment there was only the measured cadence of boots on stone, the faint breath of morning wind, and the austere geometry of marble and headstones under a rising blue dawn. In that hush, Arlington became what it had always been, a place where history was not merely remembered, but actively guarded, step by deliberate step, by a sentinel who understood that honor was never loud and never for sale. Honor was never loud and never for sale, and then the morning proved how quickly the profane world tried to put a price tag on both. Darren completed his final turn at the tomb, locked the rifle in perfect alignment, and held the stillness until the relief sequence ended with ritual precision. The crowd exhaled as one body. Coats shifted. Parents leaned down to answer whispered questions. Lily Brennan kept both hands on the folded flag in her lap, while her mother adjusted the blanket over her knees. The old Marine tapped his cane once, a private punctuation mark, and met Darren's eyes for half a second, as the sentinel passed from sacred line to controlled motion. 90 minutes later, fluorescent light replaced dawn mist, polished airport tile replaced marble, and discipline had to breathe in a different arena. Reagan National's diplomatic checkpoint carried a brittle tension that had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with rank, paperwork, and men who mistook access for entitlement. Darren stood in service dress at the lane divider, posture straight as a bayonet, white gloves still spotless, jaw scar faint under terminal light. Travelers queued in staggered lines, 2 veterans headed home with garment bags and careful posture, a school group moving in a clump, a retired military nurse from Arlington, now waiting with her carry-on by her boots, Lily and her mother in the accessible lane beside a TSA bin, where a small velvet case sat tagged and logged. The case should have moved by procedure alone. It did not. Captain Ilya Markov came at it like a man reclaiming property he believed the world had no right to touch. He was broad-shouldered, heavy overcoat hung with foreign ribbons, collar tab sharp, boots mirror dark, one gloved hand already reaching before his credentials finished scanning. The single visual detail that gave him away was not the medals. It was the smirk, thin and practiced, the expression of a parade commander who believed ceremony existed to flatter power, not submit to memory. He brushed past a uniformed screener, then drove his forearm into the side rail of Lily's chair hard enough to jolt it toward a stanchion. The checkpoint froze. One suitcase tipped and fell on its side. A teenage boy from the Arlington crowd stopped mid-step, phone in his hand but forgotten. Lily's mother grabbed the wheel handles and pulled back, breath catching sharp. Markov seized the velvet case from the bin and snapped his head toward the lane opening. And there Darren was, motionless in the path, shoulders squared, eyes unreadable. Markov barked with open contempt. Toy soldiers and tourists can keep their marble shrine. He tried to angle around him. Darren shifted one half step, exact, closing the line without touching him. What Markov saw was ceremonial cloth and a guard detail. What he did not know was that the man in front of him had spent years reading danger in fractured seconds, first in mountain dust and then on sacred stone, and that his instincts had already mapped the terminal in layers. Child to his left, hard stanchion edge 4 feet behind her. Secondary lane congested, armed federal officer 12 yards out. Camera dome above gate C post. Legal authority threshold crossed the moment an accessible passenger was shoved. He also did not know that Darren had looked once, briefly, at the reverse of the impounded metal under official supervision, and had felt old grief strike like a cold blade beneath a uniform that never betrayed impact. Markov lifted his chin and crowded the distance, velvet case clenched in one hand as if rank itself were a warrant. "Move, parade boy." His accent cut the words into flat commands. Darren did not answer. The silence landed harder than argument. Behind them, murmurs rippled through the line, small and disbelieving. One veteran whispered. He touched the kid's chair. A TSA supervisor raised a hand to his earpiece and called for airport police, voice steady but fast. Lily stared up at Darren, eyes wide but focused, flag held tight to her chest like a shield made of memory. The whole terminal seemed to narrow to 3 points. Markov's grip on the case, the child's chair inches from metal, and the white-gloved hand Darren kept open at his side, ready. In that compressed second, the same logic that governed the tomb governed the checkpoint. Protect the vulnerable. Preserve the line. Honor does not yield to arrogance, no matter what language it speaks. Markov drew breath to push again, shoulders bunching, and Darren's stance settled lower by an inch, every muscle coiled under immaculate cloth, a wall that had learned restraint the hard way. The crowd could read the tension, even if it could not name it. Gasps spread. Then silence swallowed the lane. The foreign captain had challenged the wrong man in the wrong place, and he still believed he was addressing a prop. The pressure in that aisle had been building since first light. Darren had not come to Reagan for spectacle or confrontation. He had been assigned transfer detail, a narrow institutional task executed with strict chain of custody rules after an unauthorized object was left at the tomb. In the operations corridor behind the checkpoint, the metal had arrived in tamper-evident packaging with federal documentation and military liaison signatures. He had watched the handoff, verified seal numbers, and acknowledged receipt with the same precision he brought to his posts. Maintain custody until transfer. Maintain safety. Maintain dignity for all involved. Markov leaned in another fraction, but Darren's focus stayed split across the whole geometry of risk. Potomac cold from dawn still lived in his joints, that measured cadence of 21 steps teaching the body to hold grief without display. 3 days earlier, he would have expected this assignment to end in routine signatures and a quiet departure board. Instead, at Arlington that morning, Markov had stood at the rail among observers and official visitors, overcoat immaculate, expression unreadable, and waded through the changing sequence as if studying theater cues. When the crowd thinned, he approached with diplomatic escort, requested proximity on formal grounds, and left behind the Crimson Star of Valor without authorization, placing it at the edge of sacred stone like a stage mark. No speech, no permission, no approved exchange, just a deliberate breach packaged as gesture. The protocol team recovered the object within minutes and logged it pending diplomatic review. Darren should have been emotionally irrelevant to the process after that point. He was not. During inventory verification at the secure desk, he had seen the backplate for less than a second before it disappeared into an evidence sleeve, and the inscription had reopened ground he kept sealed for functional survival, for the unnamed dead on both sides whom politics forgot. The words were not crude. They were worse. They were true in a way that collided with disciplined silence, because for one involuntary beat he heard Nate Hollis laughing in a mess tent over powdered eggs, saw the flash and dust from that evacuation corridor, and felt again the hard arithmetic of who came home and who became memory. Now, in the first week of November, Darren carried that memory as alignment rather than rupture. At the tomb, that discipline served the unknowns. At the checkpoint, it kept a private wound from steering a public action. He did not get to decide what the inscription meant geopolitically. He had one non-negotiable requirement in front of him. No ego, foreign or domestic, reached through a child in a wheelchair to claim moral ownership of the dead. The trade-off was immediate and unforgiving: ceremonial restraint against physical intervention, diplomatic sensitivity against visible protection, silence against command presence. His framework did not shift. Safety first, protocol second, pride last. Markov moved under a different logic. He carried himself like a man shaped by cameras and deference, one hand always ready to turn ceremony into personal theater. He had expected bureaucratic friction and believed rank could crush it. To the people in line, the analysis was simpler. He had crossed the line, then tried to force the line to move around him. What they could not fully see was that Darren's stillness was not passivity. It was controlled sequence: angle, distance, witnesses, legal trigger, child clearance, arm control, verbal command, containment. Lily Brennan watched all of it with the fierce seriousness she had brought to the rail at Arlington. Under open sky, she had seen Darren as a sentinel in ritual cadence. Under fluorescent hum and departure boards, she saw the same man, unchanged at the core. Her mother's knuckles whitened on the chair grips. 2 lanes over, the old Marine planted his cane and squared his shoulders, as if reporting to an old formation. The retired military nurse stood with her bag forgotten against her shin, eyes narrowed, reading posture the way she once read vital signs. The high school boy who had been distracted that morning now stood still, phone lowered, face flushed with a late, hard understanding of what respect looked like in real time. Airport police broke into view at the far mouth of the lane, dark uniforms cutting through stalled passengers, but they were still seconds out, and the aisle belonged to the 2 men at its center. Markov heard the approaching boots and made a decision born of panic and pride. He shifted his weight forward, tightened his grip on the velvet case, and drove his shoulder to force passage through Darren's line, and the terminal held its breath for the move that would decide who owned the moment. The terminal held its breath for the move that would decide who owned the moment, and in that suspended sliver of time, Every physical detail sharpened into hard focus, cold fluorescence buzzing above gate glass, the scent of jet fuel threading through recycled air, the squeak of a distant luggage wheel that no one now turned toward, the red digital crawl of departures continuing with indifferent precision, while human attention locked on one narrow lane beside a metal stanchion. Markov's decorated overcoat strained across his shoulders as he drove forward, one polished boot skidding half an inch on tile. Darren did not retreat. He stood centered, weight balanced through both feet, white-gloved hands open and disciplined, uniform immaculate despite the rush around him, every crease still sharp, collar brass catching sterile light like a blade edge, tomb guard badge fixed over his chest as if bolted there by oath rather than pin. To most travelers, it looked like a checkpoint dispute, tipping volatile. To the veterans in line, it looked older than that, a collision between earned restraint and borrowed authority. The old Marine with the cane had shifted into a stance his body remembered from decades ago. One hand braced over worn wood, chin lifted, eyes narrowed. The retired military nurse had squared her shoulders without realizing it. Carry-on forgotten at her calf. Face set in the same clinical calm she once wore before trauma doors swung open. The high school boy from Arlington, who had come that morning expecting a field trip and found a covenant, stood with his phone slack at his side, knuckles white around plastic, gaze fixed on Darren as if memorizing a standard he had not known existed. Lily Brennan sat rigid in her wheelchair, blanket askew from the jolt, folded flag pulled tight against her chest, her mother's hands locked on the grips behind her. Markov's right hand tightened around the tagged velvet case, thumb smearing across the tamper-evident strip where custody numbers still showed beneath airport glare. His jaw worked once, anger and urgency braided together. "Move," he snapped, voice low and accent hard-edged. "You are obstructing diplomatic property." Darren's expression did not change. He kept his body between Markov and the opening lane, heels planted, shoulders squared to block passage without touching him. "Step back, Captain," he said, even and audible. "Case remains impounded, pending law enforcement transfer." The TSA supervisor, 10 feet off Darren's left shoulder, had one hand at his radio and the other out toward bystanders. Her voice clipped as she repeated, "Airport police are inbound. Hold positions. Do not crowd the lane." No one moved closer. The lane seemed to narrow on its own. Markov tried the space to Darren's right, quick and abrupt, testing for daylight between stanchion post and uniformed guard. Darren mirrored him in the same beat, not lunging, simply occupying the line first, palms still open, feet adjusting by inches that looked minor to civilians and absolute to anyone who had ever trained movement under pressure. Behind Markov, a TSA officer edged a bin cart sideways to constrict the route toward the concourse doors. Another officer stepped into the adjacent lane and raised a forearm to stop curious travelers from drifting into the corridor. Every adjustment happened inside seconds. The soundscape thinned. No rolling bags in the immediate area, no half-heard gate chatter, only radio static, breath, fabric tension, and the small metallic tap of the old Marine's cane point resetting against tile. A memory flashed through Darren, brief and hard as a command. Black mat at dawn, 21 steps, turn, rifle angle exact, breath in cold air, Lily's small voice asking if he ever got tired, her mother answering that some people stand watch so the rest can keep faith. Then fluorescence returned, harsh and immediate, and Lily was no longer behind a marble rail, but 3 yards from a man willing to shove through an accessible lane for possession. Darren shifted 1/2 step left to widen the shield between Markov and Lily's chair. Lily watched him with the same unwavering focus she had shown at Arlington, fingers locked on the folded flag. Her mother leaned her weight forward against the wheelchair handles, bracing for another impact if it came. Markov read the shift and pushed harder, shoulders rolling forward like a man forcing a doorway already occupied. "I place that medal in honor," he hissed. "You have no right." Darren kept his tone level. "You can make that statement to police." Markov's eyes cut past him, measuring distance to the turnstile break and the crowd gap beyond. Calculation showed, then impatience. He feinted left, then right, trying to draw Darren into contact he could exploit. Darren gave him neither collision nor opening. His hands remained visible, controlled, and empty while his lower body locked the lane with quiet authority. The TSA supervisor repeated into her radio, louder now. "Subject still non-compliant. Foreign officer attempting forced passage. Accessible lane compromised. Expedite." The old Marine's gaze moved once from Markov to Lily and back, a silent triage check. The retired nurse tracked the same variables from a different training history: airway, panic, impact risk, exits. Her bag still hung from 2 fingers, forgotten. The high school boys swallowed and took one involuntary step backward when Markov jerked forward again, then stopped and squared himself beside a cue marker, phone now fully lowered. Around them, strangers who had no shared biography became a witness line through pure attention. A businessman in a blue suit pulled his carry-on behind his calf to clear floor space. A college student placed her backpack on the belt and stood still with both hands visible. No one shouted. The silence had acquired shape. Darren caught a second internal flash, even shorter than the first. Nate Hollis laughing over powdered eggs in Kandahar, then the same name on a casualty report in Syria hours after an evacuation run. Grief rose as heat and disappeared under discipline before it reached his face. Another line followed it, carved from this morning's evidence log. "For the unnamed dead on both sides, whom politics forgot." The words had landed with moral weight when he first read them beneath official seal. They still did. That weight did not alter procedure, did not erase chain of custody, did not license a shove that struck a child's wheelchair rail. Darren held both truths without flinching. The inscription's painful honesty and Markov's unacceptable method. "Last warning," Darren said, voice steady, eyes on Markov's center line. "Set the case down. Step back." Markov bared his teeth in something not quite a smile. "You think this is about procedure?" He dipped his shoulder and drove toward the narrow space by the stanchion again, faster this time, trying to split through before police arrived. Darren pivoted with precise economy and sealed the gap a fraction before Markov reached it. Still no contact. Just geometry, timing, and refusal. Markov's boot squealed against tile. His coat brushed the stanchion strap hard enough to make it quiver. Lily's mother pulled the wheelchair back 6 inches, wheels bumping a seam in the floor. Lily did not look away from Darren. Radio chatter sharpened at the edge of hearing, then became distinct voices. 2 airport police officers emerged from the far corridor at a controlled run, one angling to Darren's flank, the other circling wide to cut off retreat toward the escalators. Their boots hammered tile in converging beats. The TSA supervisor raised her arm and pointed. "Case in his right hand. He shoved past screening. Child nearly struck." Markov heard the approach and made his decision in real time. His grip on the velvet case climbed higher, elbow tucking close as if to shield it from a disarm. He turned his torso half away from the nearest officer, not yet fleeing, not yet surrendering, searching for one last route through people he had misjudged as passive. Darren adjusted one step to keep himself between Markov and Lily, then stopped, conserving every motion for control rather than display. His face stayed unreadable over the thin burn scar along his jaw, a pale line that caught airport light when he turned. That scar had been born in Kunar in a convoy strike and carried forward through years that taught him the costs of late decisions. He felt those years now as compressed instinct. Protect the vulnerable first, preserve evidence second, escalate force only when no alternative remains. His breathing stayed slow. His hands remained open. The M14 cadence of dawn translated into checkpoint math under fluorescence, not ceremonial now, but operational. Distance, angle, timing, witness safety, legal threshold. Markov lunged one final time, not at Darren's chest, but toward the side channel near the accessible lane, trying to slip past with speed where strength had failed. Darren moved immediately, sliding laterally, and dropping his center just enough to make his body a barrier wall. No grab, no strike, no shove, only position taken and held. Markov checked short, forced to halt by inches instead of impact, breath blasting through his nose. The velvet case jerked in his hand and settled. Behind him, one police officer closed to arm's length and commanded, "Sir, stop. Keep your hands where I can see them." The second officer took angle on the case side, ready for the next beat. Markov froze, chest heaving, eyes bright with furious disbelief. The old Marine exhaled through his teeth, a sound almost lost under airport ventilation. The nurse's shoulders lowered one measured notch, but her attention stayed locked on Markov's hands. The high school boy finally blinked, as if surfacing from a held breath he had forgotten to release. Lily tightened her hold on the folded flag until her knuckles blanched, then eased when Darren's posture told her the line still held. Her mother kept one hand on the chair grip and one across Lily's shoulder, protective and steady. Around them, the crowd remained disciplined by the gravity of what they had just watched. Authority challenged, procedures strained, violence narrowly deferred by a man who understood exactly where force begins and why restraint matters before it does. Markov's voice dropped to a near whisper that still cut the air. "You dishonor the dead by caging that metal." Darren answered without heat. "The dead are not dishonored by documentation." He glanced once toward the approaching officer on his left, confirming position, then returned his focus to Markov's hands. "Set it down, Captain." The police officer repeated the command, firmer. "Place the case on the floor now." Markov's jaw clenched. Tendons stood out in his neck. For a second, it looked as if he might either throw the case or bolt. Darren's stance tightened by a fraction, ready to intercept either motion while keeping the lane clear behind him. Every witness saw that fraction and understood what it meant. A final flash crossed Darren's mind, swift and clean. Marble, silence, the unnamed dead beneath all flags, all arguments, all speeches. Then only the checkpoint remained. Fluorescent glare, clipped commands, Lily's small breathing behind him, the weight of chain of custody and conscience aligned in one immediate decision. Airport police reached full control distance. Markov hovered at the brink, case still in his grip, shoulders quivering with the effort not to concede. Darren held his ground, disciplined and motionless, the human hinge between escalating force and lawful restraint, as the corridor stayed locked in a single, taut, held-breath standoff. The corridor stayed locked in that taut, held-breath standoff, and the center of it was Captain Ilya Markov, chest rising hard beneath a foreign overcoat, heavy with braid and ribbon, jaw set like a man unaccustomed to hearing no in any language. He had built a career on being watched. Long before he became a defense attaché with embassy access and polished diplomatic immunity, he had been the face of his nation's ceremonial brigades. The officer state media loved to frame in tight shots, sword level to the horizon, chin lifted, uniform razor fit, boots striking parade ground in mechanical thunder. He understood camera angles, understood how crowds attached meaning to cloth and metal, and understood how to convert discipline into personal myth. What he never accepted was that ceremony could outrank him. To Markov, ritual existed to project power, not submit to it. He treated memorials as stages, protocol as negotiable, and any silence he did not command as a challenge. By his second year in diplomatic circles, that arrogance had hardened into habit. He interrupted briefings. He corrected hosts on their own procedures. He carried himself through security lanes as though barriers were decorative suggestions for lesser people. There had been prior complaints, quietly filed, and quietly absorbed by bureaucracy. A customs officer shoved aside at a military terminal abroad, a wreath ceremony delayed because Markov demanded camera repositioning, a junior liaison publicly mocked for asking him to wait for clearance. None of it had yet produced the consequence that matched the pattern. Men like him often mistook delayed consequence for permission. At Arlington dawn, he had arrived with official escort and a face of controlled solemnity. Witnesses remembered the same detail in different words. The calm was too polished, too practiced, as if he were rehearsing grief instead of carrying it. He stood through the cadence. He watched Darren complete 21 steps, pause, turn, repeat, and his expression did not soften. Then, in a narrow pocket, after the crowd shifted, he moved to the edge of sacred stone and left his crimson star of valor without authorization, setting the velvet box where no foreign decoration belonged unless formally approved and jointly presented. It was not a tribute under protocol. It was an insertion, a gesture calculated to force interpretation, force coverage, force someone else to clean up the boundary he had crossed. When liaison officers recovered the medal and impounded it, Markov did not request review through channels. He erupted. Calls were made. Titles were invoked. By the time he reached Reagan National, he was operating on wounded vanity, disguised as diplomatic urgency. He came into the checkpoint believing rank would bend procedure, and that an American guard in a ceremonial uniform would fold once pressed. That misread was his fatal assumption. He saw white gloves and polished brass and concluded decoration. He did not see Afghanistan in Darren's posture. He did not see Syria in Darren's stillness. He did not see the tomb in the way Darren held a line. "Captain," the airport police officer on Markov's right said, voice clear and formal. "Put the case on the floor. Slowly." Markov's eyes stayed on Darren. "You are making an international incident over a symbol." Darren answered in the same measured cadence he used for commands at the rail. "You made the incident when you endangered a child." The words landed across the lane like a gate dropping shut. No one in the crowd mistook who had moral control of the moment now. The old Marine's hand tightened on his cane. The retired nurse angled half a step closer to Lily's chair, protective reflex overriding travel routine. The high school boy watched with his phone dead at his thigh, face pale and intent, as if trying to absorb every second into memory before adulthood could dilute it. By 9:17 that morning, 3 departure announcements had cycled overhead and gone unheard by anyone inside that lane. Markov finally looked toward the officers, calculating again. The officer on his right had a clear path to his weapon if needed, but his hand stayed visible and controlled. The officer on Markov's left tracked only the case hand, waiting for a release or a throw. The TSA supervisor remained at the perimeter, one hand at her radio, one hand signaling bystanders to stay clear. The geometry was tightening with institutional precision. Darren felt it settle in layers the way he had felt weather settle over Arlington at dawn. His internal state remained all motion under a motionless exterior. Shoulders loose, but ready. Weight balanced through the balls of his feet. Right hand open at hip level to intercept if Markov swung the case toward Lily or toward an officer. Left side angled to block the accessible lane completely. Breath counted in controlled cycles. In 4, hold 2, out 4, hold 2. He tracked the stanchion post at Lily's flank, the rolling bin cart to his rear left, the officer's foot placement behind Markov, and the bright red zipper pull on Markov's sleeve that would telegraph any rotational feint a fraction early. Combat had trained him to read bodies before they committed. Tomb duty had trained him to do it without spectacle. He felt the inscription in his mind like metal against skin. For the unnamed dead on both sides, whom politics forgot. It pressed at him from 2 directions at once. One direction was grief. Nate Hollis laughing through powdered eggs. Nate Hollis gone in smoke and dust. Names that turned into folded flags. The other direction was duty. The dead did not need Markov's theater. The dead needed the living to obey the standards built to protect their memory from ego. Darren held both truths in the same frame and gave neither permission to distort procedure. Lily's mother leaned down, voice near her daughter's ear, but audible in the quiet. "Stay with me, sweetheart. Keep your hands on the flag." Lily nodded once without taking her eyes off Darren. She had seen him under open sky and marble silence. Now she saw him under fluorescent glare and institutional tension. And in both places, the core looked the same. Markov shifted his grip, index finger sliding along the edge of the velvet case. The move looked small. Darren saw the risk instantly. A flicked wrist could send that case into the lane, under feet, toward Lily's wheels, toward a scramble that turned control into chaos. "Do not throw it," Darren said. Markov gave him a thin, contemptuous glance. "Now you give orders?" Darren's gaze did not waver. "I enforced boundaries." One traveler near the back whispered, "Who is that guy?" The old Marine answered without looking away from the lane. "Old guard." The whisper traveled in fragments. "Tomb guard." "He's a tomb sentinel?" "That's why he's so calm." The crowd did not surge or chatter. It tightened into disciplined stillness, as if the title itself carried command authority over civilian nerves. What they had read as composure became something heavier once named. This was not a decorative soldier in a transit corridor. This was a man whose profession was safeguarding national memory under scrutiny and pressure. Markov heard it too. His expression flickered. Not fear yet, but disorientation. The first crack in certainty when a target stops matching the story you told yourself about him. Darren saw the flicker and did nothing with it. No taunt, no escalation. Oh, he kept his posture where it was, a controlled barrier between vulnerability and ego. His jaw scar caught the overhead light when he turned slightly to keep Lily fully shielded. In Kunar, that scar had come from fire and impact in a convoy lane that narrowed too fast. In Syria, he had learned the cost of 1 second of misplaced attention during evacuation corridors crowded with civilians and armed panic. At the tomb, he had relearned patience as a weapon cleaner than force. All of it converged here in an airport checkpoint beside a child in a wheelchair and a velvet case full of contested meaning. "Captain Markov," the right-side officer said again, voice harder now, "you are under lawful command. Place the case on the floor, hands visible." Markov's nostrils flared. "I will hand it to my embassy." "Not in this lane," Darren said. The officer on the left added, "Non-compliance will result in restraint." A woman holding a toddler at the far barrier shifted back 3 steps and stopped, eyes fixed on Markov's hands. A veteran in a flight jacket removed his cap and held it at his chest, without seeming to notice he had done it. The retired nurse kept her weight on her front foot, prepared to move Lily if the lane broke. The high school boy swallowed and squared his shoulders again, mimicking the old Marine without knowing it. Seconds stretched and hardened. Markov did not advance. He did not retreat. His confidence was no longer broad and theatrical. It narrowed into stubborn resistance, a man trying to salvage status from a losing position. Darren's internal alerts stayed lit. He tracked tremor at Markov's wrist, micro-movements in the shoulders, eye-line breaks toward exits. He tracked Lily's breathing pace, her mother's grip pressure, the officer's spacing, the growing semicircle of witnesses behind the barrier. Every muscle in him stayed coiled for a clean intervention if the case moved toward the child. Externally, he remained what the crowd had first seen at dawn. Carved discipline, unreadable face, voice used only when required. A Pentagon liaison call patched through to the TSA supervisor's radio. She listened, glanced up, and called to the officers. Brigadier General Whitaker is en route. 2 minutes out. Hold scene. Preserve chain of custody. That name landed with the force of formal gravity. The old Marine gave a slow nod. The officers adjusted half steps, maintaining pressure, without premature contact. Markov's mouth tightened. He understood exactly what a general's arrival meant. The dispute was no longer a lane-level argument he could bulldoze. Institutional authority was converging. 3 days earlier, Darren might have expected this sort of phrase, general en route, to belong in a briefing room, not an airport aisle. Yet the underlying dynamic was familiar. Sacred duty and profane ego had collided, and now consequence was in motion. Markov made one last attempt to retake narrative control. He lifted his chin toward the witnesses and said loudly, "I honored your dead. This man insults that honor." Darren answered in a tone that carried to the back barrier without rising. "Honor does not push through the living to perform for the dead." The line froze the corridor. Even the departure chime overhead seemed to thin around it. Lily looked up at Darren with fierce concentration, and the old Marine's eyes shone once before he blinked it away. Markov's right hand twitched. The case tilted. Darren shifted one precise step, closing the angle to Lily completely while keeping his hands open and his center low. The officers moved in tandem, close enough now to take control on command. The crowd held steady, no panic, no rush, only the shared understanding that a threshold was about to break one way or the other. Darren felt the same deep alignment he had felt on black mat at dawn. Not calm as absence of fear, calm as ordered purpose. Protect the vulnerable. Preserve the evidence. Hold the line until lawful authority arrives. He stood unmoving at the center of converging pressure, every instinct firing, every muscle ready, waiting for Markov's next decision as the final seconds before intervention gathered like storm steel in the lane. Darren saw the tilt in the velvet case, saw Markov's wrist load for a throw, and the decision snapped through him with the clean finality of a command given on a live range. He moved. It was one decisive protocol breach, executed with ceremonial precision and combat economy in the same breath. His right hand shot to Markov's forearm, just above the wrist, white glove locking tendon and bone with exact pressure. His left shoulder cut across the accessible lane to shield Lily's chair. His hips rotated a quarter turn, not to punish, not to strike, but to redirect force away from the child and into empty floor space where officers could close safely. Markov's overcoat flared at the hem, medals flashing under terminal light as his balance broke forward and then stopped dead against Darren's control. The velvet case never left his hand because Darren pinned it between Markov's chest and his own service coat with a firm, immovable brace, preserving chain of custody while denying both escape and spectacle. The move took less than a second. To the witnesses, it stretched into a sequence of separate frames, glove to wrist, pivot at the waist, child cleared, case contained, lane secured. Lily's mother gasped and pulled the chair back exactly the 6 inches Darren's body had created. The old Marine planted his cane and stood taller, eyes hard and wet at once. The retired nurse reached out instinctively, palm at Lily's shoulder, then froze when she saw the line was already protected. The high school boy sucked in a breath so sharply it sounded like a cut through cloth. Darren's face never changed. Jaw scar pale under fluorescent glare, eyes fixed on Markov's center line. Breath controlled, stance rooted. He spoke one sentence, calm enough to be mistaken for quiet, hard enough to stop the entire checkpoint. You will not reach through the fallen to reach your pride. The words landed like steel on marble. Markov stopped fighting. His shoulders, which had been coiled for another surge, locked in place. For the first time since he entered the lane, he looked less like a parade commander and more like a man who had run out of script. Around them, the crowd froze in full silence. Even the nearby gate announcement seemed to recede beneath that line. The airport police moved in on Darren's control point with disciplined timing. The right side officer secured Markov's free arm. The left side officer took the case hand, fingers closing over velvet and wrist without wrenching, without chaos, exactly as trained. Darren released pressure by measured degrees only when both officers confirmed possession and balance. Case controlled, the left officer said. Subject controlled, the right added. Markov tried one final jerk against the hold, more reflex than strategy, and got nowhere. Darren stepped half a pace back, still between Lily and the center of action. Posture unchanged, open hands visible again. No triumph, no display, just a restored boundary. At 9:19 a.m., the departure board above Checkpoint C cycled to a new line of flights, while no one in that lane looked up. Markov's voice came out clipped and breath-thin. This is diplomatic property. You cannot touch me like a criminal. The right side officer answered first. You endangered a protected passenger and resisted lawful command. Then Darren spoke, each word measured. You are being held for misconduct at a federal checkpoint. Embassy notification will follow protocol. The phrase embassy notification clearly struck him as real consequence. He straightened as much as the officers allowed and scanned the witnesses as if searching for a sympathetic camera. He found veterans with flint in their faces, travelers standing rigid with crossed moral lines, and a child in a wheelchair holding a folded flag to her chest while looking at him with unblinking disappointment. The gaze hit harder than any shouted condemnation. 30 seconds later, the lane parted at the far barrier, and Brigadier General Thomas Whitaker entered with Pentagon liaison officers at his shoulder, overcoat unbuttoned from haste, stars bright against dark wool, expression carved into command. He did not ask what happened in broad terms. He read the geometry instantly. Child protected, subject restrained, evidence intact, witness field dense, discipline maintained. Report, Whitaker said. The TSA supervisor stepped forward. Captain Markov forced into the diplomatic lane, struck accessible chair rail, seized impounded item, ignored repeated commands, attempted to breach containment. She pointed to Darren. Staff Sergeant Martinez prevented contact, protected minor, maintained chain of custody. Whitaker turned to Darren. Staff Sergeant? Darren came to full attention despite the tight corridor and answered in parade ground cadence. Sir. Subject attempted forced passage with impounded metal, reached through accessible lane, presented imminent risk to minor passenger and evidence integrity. I executed controlled redirection, no strike, no unnecessary force, transferred subject to airport police control. Whitaker held his gaze for one steady second, then nodded once. Action was lawful. Action was correct. The corridor exhaled as a single body. Murmurs rose, then fell when Whitaker raised his hand. He faced Markov next. Captain Ilya Markov, you are hereby notified that your conduct constitutes diplomatic misconduct, interference with federal security operations, and endangerment of a civilian minor. Effective immediately, your movement privileges are suspended, pending formal censure through your mission and the Department of Defense liaison channel. Markov's jaw flexed. General, this is an overreach. Whitaker did not raise his voice. No, this is consequence. He gestured to the liaison officer beside him, who opened a leather folio and read from prepared language that had clearly been assembled the instant the call came through. Per intergovernmental protocol, the Crimson Star of Valor will not be released to Captain Markov in person. The item remains in U.S. evidentiary custody and will be transferred only through official military channels, accompanied by written notice of breach and formal rebuke. The words hid in layers. Not released to him, not in person. Written rebuke attached. Publicly stated in front of the people he had tried to dominate. Markov's posture shifted from defiance to rigid damage control. He drew himself upright and went silent, eyes forward, hands constrained at his sides by procedure and by humiliation that no ribbon could absorb. He had arrived expecting to bend a lane. He now stood under formal reprimand in that same lane, stripped of narrative authority by the very institutions he had assumed he could pressure. Whitaker stepped closer, close enough that only the first row heard the next line clearly. You placed ceremony above the dead and ego above a child. You will answer for both. Markov did not respond. Behind Darren, Lily finally released a breath she had been holding and leaned back into her mother's hands. Her shoulders still trembled, but her grip on the folded flag steadied. The retired nurse knelt briefly beside the chair, checked Lily's eyes and breathing with practiced gentleness, and gave her mother a small nod that said she was stable. The old Marine removed his cap, held it over his heart, and looked at Darren with the grave pride of one service member recognizing another under pressure. The high school boy wiped his palms on his jacket and stood straighter than he had all morning. Whitaker turned to airport police. Remove Captain Markov from this checkpoint. Maintain professional handling, full body cam preservation, no deviations. Yes, sir, both officers answered. As they began to escort Markov out, he twisted once toward Darren. Voice lower now, the contempt burned out of it. You think this makes you righteous? Darren met his eyes, expression unreadable. It keeps faith. Markov looked away first. The officers moved him down the corridor, boots and coat tails receding past the barrier line, until the crowd could no longer see him. No one cheered. The silence was heavier and far more final than applause. Whitaker remained in place and shifted to administrative precision. Evidence. The left side officer presented the velvet case with both hands. The tamper strip showed strain at one edge but remained unbroken. Whitaker examined the tag number, then handed it to the Pentagon liaison. Photograph all sides. Log attempted seizure. Update chain of custody notes with witness list and timestamp. The liaison nodded. Yes, sir. Darren watched the case transfer through proper hands and felt the pressure in his chest ease by a fraction. Physical evidence had stayed intact. The object that carried too much symbolic weight and too much personal grief was back inside procedure, where it belonged. Whitaker then faced Lily and lowered his tone. Miss Brennan, are you injured? Lily shook her head. No, sir. Did this soldier protect you when you needed it? She looked up at Darren, then back to the general. Yes, sir. Whitaker inclined his head to her with full formal respect, not indulgence. Thank you for your courage. He turned to Lily's mother. Ma'am, a military family liaison will walk you to your gate and remain available for statements only if you choose. No pressure. Thank you, General, she said, voice still shaky but controlled. Whitaker's next glance found the old Marine and the nurse, reading them as context witnesses. Both gave brief, confirming nods. The high school boy stepped forward half a pace and stopped, uncertain. Whitaker addressed the whole line instead. You all did the right thing by holding position and clearing space. Order saved people here. Then he looked back to Darren, and in that look there was institutional verdict, public and unmistakable. Staff Sergeant Martinez, you upheld duty under provocation, protected a child, preserved federal evidence, and honored this uniform. Stand easy. Thank you, sir. For a moment, Darren allowed his shoulders to drop one controlled notch. Inside, the old wound stirred where the inscription had struck it, but it no longer felt like a blade. It felt like weight carried in formation, shared by the living, who still chose restraint over ego. Whitaker began to move with his liaison team, then paused. Martinez, 1 hour from now, I want your written statement and body cam cross-reference at the Pentagon Annex. After that, return to Arlington. You have evening watch. Yes, sir. Good. The line belongs there. Whitaker departed down the corridor at a measured pace, authority still radiating long after he passed. TSA reopened the far lane in phases. Travelers collected bags with subdued movements and low voices. The checkpoint resumed function, but nothing about it felt ordinary anymore. Darren stepped to Lily's chair and came to one knee so his eye level met hers without looming. He kept his voice formal and gentle. Miss Brennan, do you require medical support? She shook her head again, tighter this time, then managed, I'm okay. He nodded once. You held steady. That matters. Lily looked at the folded flag in her lap, then back at him. You did too. Darren rose, returned to full posture, and signaled the liaison escort now waiting to guide her family forward. As they rolled toward the gate corridor, Lily glanced back once and lifted her hand in a small, deliberate salute, learned from watching adults she trusted. Darren answered with a precise nod, then turned toward the evidence desk, where the velvet case, retagged and sealed, waited under fluorescent light for the next lawful transfer. The checkpoint noise slowly returned, wheels on tile, scanners chiming, clipped announcements overhead, but beneath it ran a deeper cadence, the same one that had governed dawn on marble. Hold the line, protect the vulnerable, and let earned honor speak in action before words. The same cadence followed him into the annex, even with no marble underfoot. An hour after the checkpoint locked down, Darren stood in a windowless Pentagon liaison room where fluorescent light flattened every color and every statement mattered. The velvet case sat centered on a gray evidence table inside a clear secondary pouch, tag numbers facing outward, tamper strip photographed, then photographed again. A recorder light blinked red. 2 airport police officers gave synchronized timelines. The TSA supervisor read her incident log without drama. The retired military nurse, called in as a witness, described the moment Lily's chair struck the stanchion and the exact angle of Markov's arm. The old Marine gave his name, rank, and a clipped account that carried 60 years of command presence in 12 calm sentences. The high school boy, voice shaky at first, confirmed that Darren issued warnings and held position until legal thresholds were crossed. No one embellished. No one needed to. Darren's own report came in parade ground cadence, each clause clean. He documented distance, verbal commands, noncompliance, protective movement, control hold, transfer to law enforcement, release on confirmation. He noted the red zipper pull on Markov's sleeve that telegraphed the final feint. He noted the stanchion seam that could have trapped Lily's wheel. He noted the tamper strip's strained edge and the immediate reseal under dual signature. At the end, he signed with a steady hand, then cross-referenced body cam timestamps down to the second. By late afternoon, every call made during the incident had found its formal endpoint. Airport Police Dispatch closed the immediate response as resolved with no civilian injuries. TSA headquarters accepted the supervisor's escalation packet and attached video stills. The Pentagon Liaison Office logged Whitaker's field directive and uploaded the witness matrix. State Department protocol officers acknowledged embassy notification in writing. The Foreign Missions Duty Officer received the censure language and did not contest receipt. Nothing vanished into rumor. Everything entered record. Whitaker arrived for a final chain of custody review with his coat off and sleeves rolled. The look of a general who understood that paperwork was not clerical debris, but moral architecture. He inspected the new seal, verified the photo set, and signed transfer authorization for military courier release. Then he looked to Darren. Staff Sergeant Martinez, read the reverse inscription into the record. Markov stood at the far end of the room under escort. No cuffs now, just 2 officers and consequence. His ribbons were still in place, but the posture had changed. The theatrical edge was gone. He held attention because he had nothing else left that could command the room. Darren broke the seal under camera, opened the velvet case, and lifted the crimson star of valor with white-gloved care. The metal caught the overhead light. He turned it, found the etched line, and read it aloud, voice level and unforced. For the unnamed dead on both sides, whom politics forgot. Silence followed. Not hollow, but weighted. The nurse closed her eyes briefly. The old Marine's jaw tightened and released. Even the young student held still as if he understood he was hearing something larger than a disciplinary transcript. Whitaker let the silence stand, then nodded once. Entered. Markov did not speak. He stayed at attention, eyes fixed forward, arrogance stripped down to a human frame in a plain room. The line he had tried to weaponize had been put where it belonged, in shared witness, under law, beyond ego. Whitaker gave final orders. Reseal. Transfer through military channels only. Attach written rebuke and incident summary. Captain Markov departs U.S. soil under diplomatic censure. No personal handoff at any stage. Yes, sir, the liaison officer answered. The metal went back into velvet, velvet into evidence pouch, pouch into locked courier case with dual control signatures. Physical evidence, accounted for, analyzed, transferred, closed. When formal statements ended, Lily and her mother were escorted from a family room to the annex lobby for one final confirmation. Lily looked tired in that deep, quiet way children do after holding steady too long, but her voice stayed clear when she confirmed she wanted her account kept on record. The old Marine waited nearby, cap in his hands. The nurse gave Lily a small thumbs up and left for her gate, with her carry-on finally in motion. The high school boy started to say something to Darren, faltered, then tried again. Sir, I thought this morning was just ceremony. Darren met his eyes. Ceremony is what discipline looks like when a nation remembers itself. The boy nodded, and this time he did not reach for his phone. Whitaker checked his watch, then spoke to Darren in a lower tone. You're back on evening watch. Wheels up in 10. The helicopter ride was short and loud, Potomac water darkening below as the day bent toward dusk. Arlington emerged in measured geometry, white headstones catching the last thin gold at their edges. Darren changed in silence once on the ground. Every button checked, every line reset, every crease restored to exacting standard. By the time he stepped toward the tomb relief area, the sky had shifted from steel blue to ember gray, and a clean wind moved across the plaza with that November clarity that made sound travel farther. The crowd at dusk was smaller than morning, but no less reverent. Veterans in old caps, a father with 2 children standing unusually still, a couple holding hands at the rail. The old Marine had returned, cane planted, shoulders square. Lily and her mother stood just behind the front line, her wheelchair angled toward the mat, folded flag in her lap, blanket neat again. She had not left the city after all. The liaison had rebooked their travel for the next day at her mother's request. Some places ask you to stay until your breathing catches up with your heart. Darren took post. His boots struck black mat and marble in that ancient measured rhythm. 21 steps. Pause. Turn. Repeat. The rifle moved in perfect sequence. White gloves stayed pristine in the failing light. His face returned to its unreadable stillness, a mask of discipline, carrying private weather no witness needed to see. Inside, the day settled into ordered compartments. The lane, the child, the case, the inscription, the signatures. The silence after the reading. Nothing denied. Nothing dramatized. Aligned. As twilight deepened, the flag above the plaza snapped once in the wind and streamed hard against the darkening sky. The sound cut through the hush like a clear command. Heads lifted, then bowed. The old Marine removed his cap and held it to his chest. Lily mirrored him with her small hand over the folded flag. At the completion of a cycle, during the controlled interval as visitors shifted behind the rail, Whitaker approached the perimeter with no entourage and stood with the observer's stillness of a man who had already made his judgment. He did not interrupt the ritual. He simply watched Darren complete another turn, then stepped back into the crowd and let the post remain what it was meant to be: sacred labor, not personal stage. When relief came and Darren transitioned off the line, Lily's mother asked quietly if she might bring her forward for a moment. The supervising sergeant approved with a brief nod. Lily rolled to the designated point near the rail, eyes wide in the dusk. "Staff Sergeant," she said, voice trembling but steady, "do unknown soldiers on every side still matter?" Darren stood at attention for 1 heartbeat longer, then softened his tone without losing form. "They do, when the living remember them right." Lily absorbed that, then gave him a careful salute. Elbow a little high, fingers imperfect, sincerity absolute. Darren returned a precise nod and touched 2 gloved fingers to the brim of his kepi in acknowledgement. The old Marine watched that exchange with wet eyes he did not hide this time. He stepped closer as Lily's chair rolled back and spoke to Darren in a low, gravel voice. "Name's Walter Green, chosen survivor's son, Vietnam infantry. I gave you that look this morning because I wanted to see if the line was still real." He glanced toward the tomb. "It is," Darren answered simply. "Yes, sir." Green extended his hand. Darren took it and took a grip met grip, old bone and younger steel, no speeches needed. Night settled fully over Arlington. The final visitors drifted toward the paths, quieter than when they arrived. The nurse's earlier witness statement had already cleared review and been marked complete. The airport reports were filed. The censure packet moved through secure channels. The Crimson Star was in locked courier transit. Rebuke attached, no longer a prop in a man's hand, but a documented object in lawful process. The loaded glances of the day had all found voice, and the ones that did not were named by silence and released. Darren returned to the mat for his next sequence. 21 steps. Pause, turn, repeat. Boots on marble answered the wind. Headstones stretched into darkness like ranks that never broke. The flag moved above them, steady and unowned. In that measured cadence, the day's noise fell away, and the moral line stood clear as stone. Rank can posture, ego can shout, politics can maneuver, but earned honor endures only when it bows before the dead and keeps watch for the living.